He led the revolution in Cuba when he was only 32 years old. When he was giving his victory speech in the capital Havana, so a dove came and sat on his shoulder. In the eyes of the crowd listening to the speech, it was an unseen sign that God had chosen this man to lead us. Then he was the hero of the Cuban people as long as he lived and still is today. Today we are showing you the story of Fidel Castro, the founder of the Communist Revolution in Cuba. It was in 1940 that U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt received a letter written in English from Cuba. The letter writer congratulated Roosevelt on his third term as president, and also made a unique request. He wrote, "Send me a $10 bill because I have never seen it." The White House sent the Cuban boy a letter of thanks, but not $10. The 16-year-old boy's name was Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro was the son of a large landowner in eastern Cuba. His father had 25,000 acres of land on which he grew sugarcane. Castro came to study in Havana, the capital of Cuba, 800 kilometers away from his hometown of Varan. But he was more interested in politics than studies, and the reason was the University of Havana. Here Castro had enrolled to study law, but circumstances and events were teaching him the lesson of politics. The university was home to student organizations. Heated political debates among students were commonplace. Knives and guns were often brought out during these conflicts. Castro also became a part of university politics. He used to go to the meetings of student organizations and address them. He was a great orator and used to impress with his speeches. In 1947, Castro joined the Cuban Orthodox Party. This party was running on the slogan of bringing honest leadership to Cuba and improving the lives of the poor. Then the following year, in 1948, Castro saw an amazing sight. As it happened, Castro went to Colombia for a student conference. Meanwhile, a labor leader was shot dead in Colombia. Agitated people attacked government buildings and set vehicles on fire. These scenes made Castro realize that people can go to any lengths to bring about change if they want to. So after learning this lesson of popular movement from Colombia, Castro returned to his homeland. 4 years later, in 1952, Castro also became a candidate for a seat in parliament. But this election did not happen, because just 3 months before the election, former Cuban President Batista seized power with the help of the military. He banned political parties, jailed opponents, and shut down critical newspapers. By then, Castro had earned a law degree and was practicing in Havana. He also got married to one of his university friends, Murata Diaz, with whom he also had a son. But when Batista came to power in Cuba, Castro abandoned his quiet life and took up arms, and a fight ensued. On the morning of the 26th of July, 1953, a convoy of 26 cars headed for the Moncarta military barracks in Santiago, Cuba. Castro and his 160 companions were riding in these vehicles. Castro's plan was that first the soldiers would loot the weapons depot near the barracks. Then the barracks will be taken over, and the revolution will be announced over the radio. But Castro's plan soon fell apart. Castro did not find the arms depot, but the soldiers in the barracks opened fire on Castro's convoy. 8 of Castro's colleagues were killed there. He escaped to the mountains with the rest of his companions, but was captured 5 days later. He was tried for treason and sentenced to 15 years. Castro was then locked up in this prison on Cuba's second-largest island. His brother Raúl Castro was also imprisoned. But prison life turned out to be a blessing for Fidel Castro. He started reading books in prison and began to smuggle out his speeches and revolutionary ideas by writing them down. Castro's supporters spread copies of these papers all over Cuba. There was apparently no chance of Castro's release, but then suddenly, quite unexpectedly, Castro was released. What happened was that in November 1914, Batista announced his victory by holding a fake presidential election. In celebration of this fictitious victory, he released all political prisoners, including Fidel Castro and Raúl. On May 15, 1955, Castro was released from prison, but he was not happy about his release. He had learned that his beloved wife, Murata, was working for the government during his imprisonment. It was a big emotional blow for him. Castro divorced his unfaithful wife, whom he had married for love. Then he made his way to Mexico with his brother Raúl Castro. Castro camped in Mexico City. He named the movement the 26th of July Moment in memory of his comrades killed during his first revolt. He was now training Cuban citizens living in Mexico for armed revolution. On this, the Mexican immigration authorities put Castro in jail. Che Guevara was also imprisoned for helping Castro, and the two were kept in the same cell. Che Guevara and Castro also met in Mexico. The two soon became close friends, and Che Guevara joined the Cuban Revolution. Now Che Guevara also had to eat the air of prison for being an accomplice of Castro, but the Cuban authorities soon released both. When Castro was released from prison, he intensified his efforts. He read books on guerrilla warfare methods and trained his comrades extensively. Wealthy Cubans living in Mexico and the United States also generously gave money to Castro. When Castro's preparations were complete, the moment of revolution arrived. On the night of November 25, 1956, a boat left Mexico for Cuba. By the way, this boat named Guernama had room for only 8 to 12 people. But at that time, 82 people were riding in it. Among them were Fidel Castro, Raúl Castro, and Che Guevara. The boat, which is now preserved in a museum in Havana, braved hurricanes and reached its destination on December 2nd, but got stuck in low water and mud on the beach. Castro and his companions left the boat and walked through the water and mud until they reached the shore. But what is it? They were attacked from all sides by the soldiers of President Batista. About 70 revolutionaries were killed there, captured or escaped. Some of those caught were executed by firing squads. Fidel Castro, Raúl, Che Guevara, and 9 of their companions barely escaped to the mountains and took refuge in the Sierra Mestre region. Castro was not easy to find in this forested mountainous region. Here Castro built his military base, and with the help of the local population, he also prepared a guerrilla army. At first he had only a few hundred people with him, but then the number kept increasing. Now, whenever Batista's army entered these forests looking for Castro, Castro's guerrilla force pushed them back. This game continued for about a year and a half. President Batista was very worried about this fight. He used to review the maps himself and issue attack orders to the army, but his every move was backfired. In June 1958, Batista's army made a final assault on Sierra Mestre. It was called Operation Verano, but by August, Batista's army was badly defeated. Now Castro launched a counterattack on the government. On December 27, 1958, Castro won a decisive victory in the war when the revolutionaries led by Che Guevara captured the city of Santa Clara. A few days after this incident, on January 1, 1969, President Batista fled Cuba, and the capital Havana was captured by Castro's supporters. When Fidel Castro entered Havana on January 9, 1969, the streets of the city were thronged with welcoming crowds. People were chanting, "Fidel long live! Fidel long live!" Castro was now all in all on Cuba. The revolution in Cuba had been successful, but now this country was going to become a battleground between two powers. These powers were America and Soviet Russia. Castro's focus was clearly on Soviet Russia. He nationalized the businesses of American companies in Cuba and also signed a trade agreement with Soviet Russia in 1960. Now the United States began to consider Castro as a threat to itself. So the American CIA came up with a plan to get Castro out of the way. Under this plan, 1,500 Cuban citizens living in the United States were given training and weapons to attack Cuba. These invaders landed at 2 places in Cuba, known as the Bay of Pigs, with the help of the U.S. Navy. But Castro's army was ready for a fight because of intelligence. He surrounded the attackers. Castro himself arrived at the front line and oversaw the fighting. The attackers were soon forced to surrender. Cuban forces even shot down a few American ships that came to help the invaders. This failed CIA operation was a big blow to America's superpower status. Due to this failure, U.S. President John F. Kennedy had to face worldwide embarrassment. After this incident, Castro became even more against the United States. Now he openly declared himself to be a communist. In his televised address on December 2, 1961, Castro said, "I am a Marxist and a Leninist, and will remain so until my last breath." But Castro didn't just make that announcement. He made a deal with Soviet Russia that shocked the United States. In 1962, Cuba allowed Soviet Russia to build a missile base in Cuba under an agreement. In response to this agreement, the U.S. Navy surrounded Cuba and threatened to destroy any Russian ship carrying missiles to Cuba. Due to the American threat, the world was on the brink of nuclear war. But Soviet Russia, acting wisely, removed the missile bases from Cuba. Thus, this conflict was avoided. But the hostility between Cuba and the United States continued. The U.S. continues to impose trade embargoes on Cuba. Attempts were made to kill Castro several times, but he escaped each time. The U.S. government also gave asylum to Castro's opponents in their country. A large number of these people still live in the area of the American city of Miami, which is called Little Havana. In addition to being the military leader of Cuba, Fidel Castro was also the country's prime minister and then president. There is no doubt that he was a dictator and was also harsh on his political opponents. But most Cubans were happy with it, because he took their land from rich people and distributed it to the poor. He also built large-scale schools and hospitals in Cuba that greatly benefited the common people. But the Cuban economy remained largely dependent on the aid of Soviet Russia. So when Soviet Russia disintegrated in 1991, the $6 billion aid to Cuba was stopped. Due to poor economic conditions and the cessation of oil imports from Russia, people were forced to travel in horse-drawn carriages instead of cars. To fix the economy, Castro promoted tourism in Cuba. On the other hand, after the collapse of Soviet Russia, there was some relaxation in the U.S. sanctions. Due to his poor health, Fidel Castro temporarily handed over the powers of the president to his brother Raul Castro in 2006. 2 years later, in 2008, he resigned from the presidency. After leaving the presidency, Castro rarely appeared before the media. He last attended the meeting of the Communist Party of Cuba in Havana in April 2016. 7 months after this incident, 90-year-old Fidel Castro died on November 25, 2016.
The death of Fidel Castro, who became a rebel, who became president, the de facto dictator of Cuba, dead tonight at the age of 90.
His death was announced on TV by his brother and President Raul Castro.
Russia. The countries had close ties with Cuba dating back to the revolution. President Vladimir Putin praised Castro, calling him, quote, a symbol of an era. Xi Jinping said in a statement that the Chinese people have lost a close comrade. The two communist leaders were pictured together numerous times.
The whole country was saddened by his death, but there were some people outside of Cuba who were celebrating his death. Yes, after hearing the news of Castro's death, thousands of people took to the streets in Little Havana, Miami. The people danced happily, singing songs and waving American and Cuban flags.